begin for a moment with the hush that lives at the top of the wall. The air there is thinner and sharper, the sort that cuts words into clean pieces. Men have stood at that height for thousands of years, their breath turning to ghost plumes that drift south. 700 feet of ice stacked into a mountain straight as a plumb line, with gates that are tunnels rather than doors, a road of frozen blue that swallows footsteps. It was built, so the stories say, after the world nearly ended. That is the part that matters most. People can forget a battle, but they do not forget a winter that eats the sun. The night's watch rose from that wound like a scab that would not loosen. It was never meant to crown a victor. It was meant to hold a line. From the beginning, the order was built to be more than swords. Rangers slipped into forests where the light turned green, then black, moving quietly and watching what moved in turn. Builders tended the ice and the heavy stones set into it. They repaired steps, winches, and hoists, and patched keeps that cracked and sagged in the deep cold. Stewards were the hands that kept men alive between battles, cooking and counting, nursing sores and reading ravens. They trained boys who were awkward, cold, and scared, until they were silent, cold, and brave. The wall did not need heroes every day. It needed competence, repetition, patience. What bound them was the vow. To say the words was to close a door that would not open for you again. No lands, no wives, no sons, no crowns. Once in black, you were not your father's son in any way that could be counted. You honored all kings. You obeyed none. You lent your swords to no lord's quarrel. This neutrality was not apathy. It was armor. While the South bled for chairs, the watch kept staring into the dark. When a young commander later answered a king with, "I am the watcher on the walls, the sword in the darkness," he was not being poetic. He was naming a job description. To feed such a frontier, the realm had to reach back from the ice into the hills and plains. There lay the gift, and later the new gift, rolling fields broken by pine and stones as big as a man's chest, with soil thin in some places and rich in others, yet enough to grow barley, oats, and roots that kept well. Villages and small holds were meant to live there under the shadow of the watch, safe because of it, taxed by it, and supplying it in turn. The plan was simple and elegant. A standing order with a self-sustaining larder meant the kings in their cities did not have to think about the edge each season. The frontier would pay for the frontier. There was a time when great houses sent sons north not to hide them, but to honor them. Every brother began the same, but not every choice that brought him there was equal. Imagine the weight of a crown refused. A Targaryen prince took the crows and became Master Aemon, a healer among hunters, a counselor among men who could not read letters without moving their lips when they arrived. He lived a lifetime in service, a promise kept so long it bent the mind to hear it. The watch made room for such men. That was part of its power. Bastards came because there was no other seat at their father's table, yes, but princes came because duty needed a temple. The wall was that temple. Children felt it like a blanket. In the north, a mother could tuck in her son and speak a prayer as if it were fact, that there are monsters in stories, shadows that stalk and the dead that walk, but they cannot pass while the wall stands strong, and the men of the night's watch remain true. A vow repeated by strangers in a place the child would never see became the mortar of his house. This is what an institution can do when people believe in it. It writes good sleep. Walk now to the height where a green boy would squint south and see the plains tapering beyond the new gift. He would try to measure distance with his arms spread, laugh at himself for thinking the wall could be seen from 50 leagues away. In the distance, 19 fortresses dotted the line, grim brows on a frozen face. Some were small, some proud and near palatial in their way. But each was a heartbeat that kept the blood moving along the border. To man them all was dear in men and money. Still, for long ages, it was done. Daily life was work more than war. In the yards, masters-at-arms walked among rows of recruits who slipped their feet on rime-glossed flagstones, correcting grips and stances with patient hands. At the forges, a one-armed smith cursed the iron when it stubbornly cooled too fast. In kitchens, a cook tasted stew with a burned spoon and added salt with a miser's pinch. In the rookery, maesters and stewards eased ravens onto wrists and traced inked warnings that had to fly before the snow worsened. Out on the haunted forest's eaves, rangers marked trees with knives, notches that could lead their brothers home. This was a society with its own organs, all of them tuned to winter. The rules about kings mattered because the South could never be trusted to leave the frontier alone. The watch paid honor to all but obeyed none, offering a courteous bow to any crowned snake or saint, then turning back to the ice before their heads stayed down too long. It was a practiced balance that relied on dignity and a shared story. In a world where marriage politics, feuds, and rebellions bent every oath, the watch's vow did not bend. That firmness gave it moral shine, and yet a truth stood beside that shine, even in better days. The edge was far. The winters were long. The work of keeping 19 castles alive strained any larder. The gift and new gift were generous ideas, but they were not always generous in yield, nor were they always full of willing farmers. Then there was the simple fact of human nature. When a king needed friends, sending coin and men to the border did not win as much love as feasts and purses in the city. The watch's distance, which was part of its purity, was also part of its risk. That distance became a raw edge when a king, fired by purpose and fresh from southern wars, rode to the wall with banners snapping in a wind that did not care. He meant to place his men in the ancient forts, to turn old stones into a ladder for new loyalties. The Lord Commander refused. He spoke of bones and blood in the mortar, and of a first purpose that would be profaned. In that stance you could hear the watch's old independence, and also the slow weakness that made the king see the castles as near abandoned prizes. When doubt creeps into how others speak of your work, it often grows from the bare places in your own ranks. Even in the black-clad ranks, recruiters called wandering crows walked the realm, collecting orphan boys and those trading a noose for the wall. That practice existed for a long time, and not all of those who arrived in chains were low or cruel. Some were men who made one mistake too many. Some were rivals spared a cleaner death by a cunning lord who saw advantage in mercy. Still, when the ratio bends and the wagons hold more straw for prisoners than skins for volunteers, the brotherhood changes. We are not there yet. Not in this chapter, but you can taste the snow before it falls. Press your palm to the ice, and imagine what it meant when that cold was the last thing a man felt before sleep each night. It made them hard, but not unfeeling. They wrote letters to families who would never reply, since answers would break the vow's clean line. They trained boys and named them brothers when those boys were grown. In the vaults of the night fort, the oldest of the castles, men told stories of tunnels and of things that moved within. In sunlight they laughed at those tales, because laughter pushed the darkness back a few inches. Rituals grew, small ones and grand ones, because ritual gives shape to endurance. Look out across the new gift one last time with eyes that still assume it will be enough. The fields seem to go on forever. From a hill, the sky feels higher than in the neck, and the wind tells you the world is large and clear. It is a mood a realm can get lost in. Abundance, once imagined, becomes a promise, then becomes a blindfold. The watch did its part to feed that sense of safety. That was its job. It built a story so strong that people began to mistake the story for the wall itself. And yet, in the cracks where ice melts and freezes again, pressure builds. In the empty halls of a few northern castles, doors hang crooked, and snow creeps under the sill. A few stations fall quiet and are not reclaimed when spring returns. A boy asks why the three-eyed crow cannot simply meet them at the wall, because crows have wings. That is a child's logic set against a grown world's attrition. The watch still stands, the rangers still ride, the builders still climb, the stewards still count, and a prince-turned maester still whispers counsel in the rookery at night. But a question has been born, carried on a cold wind from the south, as much as from the forests beyond. If this was once the pinnacle of duty, why do carts rattle toward the gate bearing men in chains? Why do some castles show no fire behind their arrow slits? The vows are the same, and the wall is the same, but the world beyond has shifted. What broke first? The money, the law, the crown's attention, or the people's belief? We will not decide that here. We will mark the vow into the air one more time, feel the shape of the words that ended one life and made another, and hold the contradiction to the light like glass. Snow buries silence better than any priest. It softens a broken fence, swallows the furrows where oxen once pulled, and spreads a white sheet over the shape of a life that has moved on. In better years, riders coming south from the wall spoke of crofts tucked against low stone walls. They told of smoke worming from peat chimneys, of children setting snares in alder thickets, of women mending nets by dim winter light. Then one winter ran long, and before the thaw could steady a hand to seed, another came hard on its heels. The fence posts stayed crooked. The thatch peeled away. Wolves learned the paths between doors. A croft can be lost by inches, then by miles, then by memory. Queen Alysanne did not deal in memory as she crossed those pale fields. She set her hand to the grit of Brandon's gift, and named the soil for what it was. Thin and stony, the hills empty of people, the watch hungry for coin and hungrier for grain when the white months came hard. She urged a remedy, a new strip of land south of the old Grant, a doubling that might, if only on a map, put more stew in Castle Black's pot. Lord Alaric Stark balked, knowing the lords who held those acres would not welcome the loss, but Alysanne did not flinch. She pressed him, and he yielded. With a stroke, the gift became two gifts, old and new, a belt twice as wide around the wall. Land alone is not bread. Land must be peopled, and peopled land must be protected. The new gift was a promise, but it was also an expectation. And expectation is a kind of tax. Those farms, spread over a broader band of cold and brush, would demand roads to bring carts, garrisons to answer horns, and riders to shadow the hedgerows where raiders slip. The watch already struggled to hold 19 castles with fewer men each passing year. Every tower, sealed for want of hands, left another dozen miles of cropland unwatched. The parchment grant had weight in King's Landing. In snow and shadow, it was a line no ranger could feel with his fingers. The seasons practiced their own politics, as they always had. A long summer warms the spine. A heavy wheat head makes a man believe next year will be the same, and the year after, and the one beyond. Then an early frost kills the barley, and blackens the turnips, and spring crawls up like a wounded thing, late and meager. Out on the farmsteads, they wait for the watch to ride when horns blow in the night, or when a familiar cow does not low at dawn, its tether cut in the dark. If the riders do not come, the memory of a long summer cannot feed a child. The choice is simple then. Load the wagon, nail the shutters, or do not bother with nails. Go south. South can be a matter of 10 miles or 10 days. It might mean settling under a bannerman who still posts men on a palisade at night. It can also mean living just beyond the border of the watch's lands, where a lord's justice still holds, and his riders answer to him, not to black brothers who cannot be everywhere. The edge of the gift becomes a sieve, and families slip through it, not in revolt but in self-preservation. The ranger companies, thinned by weather and short rations, cannot keep watch over that many paths at once. A raider only needs to find one that is empty. In the ledgers at Castle Black, entries do not vanish when the crofts are gone. They endure as names and as lines where rent should be, as tallies of oats expected from mills that no longer turn. The watch has always been a landholder as much as a guard. Its kitchens rely on lambs born in mud in the dark week of dusk, on cheese that must be turned, on rye that needs a circle of warm bodies to carry it from furrow to oven. When the tenants go, the granaries echo. There is no merchant road across the gift worth taxing. There are no sept tithes to claim. You count candles, you cut rations, you close another gate. When the new gift was proclaimed, it was not only a boon, but a bruise. The lords who had to part with it did so under charm and royal will, not zeal. They could not unwrite the grant, but they could cloud its borders, whose herds could graze the winter stubble without coin changing hands, who held the right to collect a market's dues at the crossroad where two villages met. When horns sounded and shadows moved, who would ride? The Black Brothers did not have the men to police each dispute. Horses and food and time do not multiply at a scribe's flourish. It took a queen to double the gift. It would take thousands of small daily choices to make it live, and many of those choices were made by men who resented losing it in the first place. The Iron Throne's law was meant to end the endless small wars of the past. Aegon spoke of the king's peace and regular taxes and duties throughout the realm, and the great and small kept their pits and their gallows on their own lands. He also swore that the holy men and women of the faith and the wealth of their septs would be exempt from taxation. Those changes calmed roads and fattened coffer chests 1,000 leagues from the wall. They also trained the realm to look south for judgment and coin. The Night's Watch sat awkwardly in that world, ancient, northern, and their lands outside the ordinary webs of liege and tithe. Exemptions for the faith meant more coin stayed in septs, and customs regularized at ports made southern lords vigilant over their own dues. Grain that might once have been offered northward in hard years was pledged to pious works or local peace instead. Culture can move grain as surely as wagons do. The Andals brought their new music and their bright septs, and in those songs winter became a season, not a sentence. In the reach of the faith of the Seven, honor tilted toward tourneys, toward courtly profit, toward causes one could see and bless. A sworn brother of the wall was brave, but he was also a figure of frostbitten austerity when the South bloomed with easier honors. Once, second sons rode north to make a name where names were not bought with silks. Over time, more of them chose the citadel's chains, or a cloister's comforts, or stayed near their mothers to press claims through marriage. The watch still took in good men, but fewer from great houses arrived with gold, bonds, and retinues attached. Even the cautionary stories meant to steal the watch cut both ways. The tale of the Night's King, a lord commander who loved a pale woman and traded his soul and duty for one frozen embrace, warned of decay from within. It urged vigilance against power stripped of purpose. Yet by hearthlight, it also made the watch seem a place where that decay could take root. People left with two lessons, and the gentler one was this. The Black Brothers were not beyond corruption. That did not empty the barracks in a year. It only made the council to take the black a little slower on the lips of those with sons to send. On parchment, the watch now held a belt of land twice as wide. On the ground, that belt was full of gaps. Rangers sent to collect rents found doorways cold. A tithe of wood meant for the castle forges lay as ash, after raiders fired the stockpiles and vanished beneath the trees. No scribe could make the weather soften, or the woods yield their paths. In a good month, a collector might reach 3 hamlets, patch a palisade by bartering salt beef, and promise a patrol that would arrive only if the snows did not rise. In a bad month he returned bloodied and lucky to come back at all. Think of one family gone, and what it removes beyond bodies. The man who mends the village wheel is also the voice who calls the alarm first. His wife knows which fence line droops for lack of a nail, and which neighbor keeps his horn within reach. His eldest has a hand that can string a bow on a run. When they tie their goods and refuse to wait for a rider, Their leaving thins the invisible net that holds a frontier together. Rails rot. Ditches fill. The trail to the next stead grows vague, then lost, so that the next man to go cannot find a kind road even if he wishes to stay. Alisande's gift carried strings of expectation that tangled as the years passed. With the new gift, some in King's Landing believed the Watch's land wealth had been made secure, and their pockets could close a rung. In the north, lords who had yielded ground believed the Watch should now bear more of the burden of keeping raiders out of the older holdings beyond. The Watch's commanders, pinched between dwindling tenants and growing obligations, could only spread thin. A promise had become a measure, and they were always found a hand short. The Queen's insight had been right about thin soil and hungry winters. Her remedy was merciful. The remedy also wrote checks on the body of an institution already running a fever. There is a reason that 9 and 10, and finally 16 of 19 castles went dark. A line that tries to hold everywhere will hold nowhere if the hands are few. Commanders closed little keeps first, the ones that demanded the most for the least, hoping a tighter line would be stronger. The shuttered towers freed men for the remaining forts, but the land beyond those empty gates did not stop needing riders. Every shutter multiplied the miles each patrol had to cover, until the nights between lanterns were long enough for men with quick feet and quiet boots to dance between. The long miles changed who came. A great lord's son recites his forebears, and weighs honor against comfort with clear eyes. If he expects to die far from songs, with no small estate to soften the end, he will choose another path. The Watch received instead the sons of petty lords, whose small scandals could vanish behind the black cloak, or whose purse could not buy a squire's place on the tourney grounds. They also received small folk who came not to join a legend, but to find bread and a bed within high walls. There was dignity in that, yet hunger is not a steady recruiter. In hard winters men swore oaths out of fear, and fear fails under strain. It is tempting to mark the descent in one stroke, but the strokes blurred until a southern policy made them hard. There came a time when kings, or their officers and liege lords, began sending men north in their hundreds, and then in their thousands, a river of wrists already raw from rope. The Watch found itself hard-pressed to feed them. The worst of that inflow broke into open blood, and a northern lord paid with his brother's life to put the oathbreakers down. That was not the beginning of decline. It was what happens when you pour bodies into empty granaries and call it help. The riot was a symptom of earlier hunger, and of the widening space between parchment authority and winter truth. Years later, a Stark of Winterfell spoke of a different cure, one that acknowledged what the Watch had always known. Land must be peopled. He dreamed of raising new lordlings to hold abandoned towers as a shield against the raiders, with their taxes sent to Castle Black rather than Winterfell. The Watch would yield part of its lands to gain more eyes and more axes along the wall of farms. It was a spring plan. Even he said so. Spring is when promises might lure families north. You do not ask a man to move his children into frost. The winter grew long. The promise never had its chance. The men who held the dream were lost or killed, and the towers stayed empty. While the realm argued and dreamed, the land rewrote its rules. Trees crept back over old pastures as hedges went untended. Wolves and men both learned the quiet hours between patrols. The gift felt less like a quiet patrimony and more like a marshland, a place where coin is tucked into hearth ashes and a horn call is only a polite wish. Along its edges, black cloaks and lordly colors crossed paths and purposes. Questions of who chased which raiders, who tried whom, and who owed warning and aid were no longer tidy once the lines on maps outran the lines of riders on the ground. Memory did little in the south. In King's Landing, the wall was a tale told to visitors, a white line like a bone at the edge of a feast. The faith-blessed kings who prized tournaments, ports, and harvest levies. Grain fleets mattered, And roads mattered. The green river valleys with their fragrant orchards mattered. The wall mattered in the mouths of heralds and in vows recited at court. But men fund what they fear, and fear travels only as far as stories can carry it. Law stepped in where land had fled. When coffers were thin and farms fewer, the watch could no longer choose its recruits by pedigree and purpose. Lords across the realm saw use in offering black in place of a rope or a sword's edge. For a time, this seemed like an answer. Crime turned into penance. Rebels turned into guards, debts into duty. Yet a man sent in chains has no stake in the fence he mends, but the fear of the man who holds the whip, and there are never enough whips. Bodies without bread only drive the pantry empty faster. Commanders begged grain from the south, or argued for coin in the next royal progress. They still had more mouths than reasons to keep those mouths quiet in the dark of a storm. At the base of it all, the slow work of winter and of distance wore the watch to the grain. There were lords who balked when the new gift took shape, and their balking did not end with the queen's kiss. There were crofts built with hope and left with haste. There were laws that made the realm peaceful and pious, and in that peace and piety, the old northern fear grew quaint. There were stories that tried to teach vigilance and accidentally also taught doubt. There were castles shut one by one, and the miles between lanterns thick with shadow in which anything could happen, and often did. None of this is a single villain. It is a field of small frosts. If an institution is a body, its land is its blood, its roads are its veins, and its winter stores are its breath. When the new gift was set down on vellum, that body seemed strong to anyone with a ruler. In truth, its blood had thinned, its veins were silted, and its breath caught in its chest at night. A wise queen saw the hunger clearly. The land had doubled, yet the mouths multiplied faster than the cows. The frontier widened even as the saddle count fell. The lords who lost ground stepped back. The lords in the south faced their own reforms and their own prayers, and none of those men woke in the night to answer a horn in a pine wood 1,000 leagues away. The erosion began in the fields, in the weather, and in the long pull of distance. Only later did law and politics turn harsh seasons into policy. Grain failed, tenants left, raiders learned their routes, and patrols came too late. Coffers thinned, and the courts and castles of the south found a use for those they did not want. The wall took them because it had to, because the vow is a net that catches the guilty and the willing alike, and because saying no without food behind it is only a sound. The old order that once made the wall a magnet for proud men did not die in a duel. It leaked away day after day, which returns us to the question that all those lines and legends only postpone. Once the fields thinned and the coffers lightened, and once the new gift stretched a belt, the watch could not cinch who would come north to keep the fires lit. If honor no longer pulled sons from the south, and grain could not keep them once they arrived, what bargain would fill the ranks? Would it be a bargain with crowns, with courts, with lords eager to make their troubles go away? Or a bargain with the very people the wall was said to hold at bay? The answer would decide not only who stood the night watch, but what the night's watch had become. The next riders approach out of the storm. It begins, as so many institutional pivots do, in the places no one writes songs about. In courtrooms where a lord wears the weight of too many trials. In dungeons where straw is changed less often than the seasons, and the jailer has learned to look past the cough. The wall between an oath and a sentence thins first in practice, not in principle. A judge who once hanged a man without a second thought finds a new mercy in an old tradition. Take the black, he says. Live in service instead of dying at my word. It is a fair offer in the language of the law, and a miracle in the language of the condemned. Yet every bargain makes the next one easier. The pattern hardens in the capital where the cells fill fastest. Yoren comes through the city gates with a wagon, a rasping voice, and papers that open doors most men never see. He is not a jailer, and not exactly a priest. He is a recruiter with a list of names and the quiet authority of an institution older than any throne. He surveys the black cells, not for innocence, but for endurance. Can they march? Can they keep moving north without a knife in another man's ribs? He does not pretend these boys and men are what the watch was meant to be. He knows what they are. He takes them anyway. And the crown marks another day when a problem walks out of the city and never returns. The Night's Watch has saved the realm from northern failures before. Now, it solves southern ones too. The ritual still holds at the top of the world. The speech is set, and it is good. Whatever you were, leave it behind. On the wall, we are all one house. Your crimes will be washed away, your debts forgiven. Our wife is duty. Our mistress is honor. The language is not apology, it is conversion. It announces a new life that makes the old one small, then wipes it clean. The man who speaks it might be bald as winter light and hard as old oak. He believes every word when he looks into a line of faces that carry more scars than sigils. The vow is not a sentence when it is said in the cold. It is a shield raised against all the nights that follow. Still, a truth sits under those words that no feast can hide. When sworn brothers once came mostly by choice, the ritual crowned a decision. When they come now in chains, it bleaches a bargain. Crowded cells, and the convenience of distant exile, change the composition of any army. The watch used to count on miners' sons from proud houses, ambitious squires who had quarreled with a father, hard men who found a cause when all other causes bored them. You still see that now and then at the start of winter. A Royce in Castle black velvet, stiff with the belief that honor makes you bulletproof. A barrow or a flint whose family has always kept one eye on the edge of the map. But the bulk of the line is different. Outlaws, poachers, debtors, killers, and thieves. Children with no surnames and men with names they refuse to give. Some can be shaped, while a few have steel in them that only needed quenching. Others never stop looking back at a life the law decided to close. The law itself becomes the pipeline. Judges do not like to think of themselves as recruiters, but the books allow it, and the city needs it. The gold cloaks would rather march a chain north and swing a sword in a muddy alley every week for the same faces. Guilds complain about theft. Silent sisters complain about corpses. A captain of the watch learns that a man who vanishes up the King's Road will not be seen by angry neighbors again. And so the sentence spreads. Instead of cutting off rot at the wrist, the realm learns how to ship it somewhere cold. Ships bring grain north now and then, but more often they bring names. The practice grows fat on exceptions. Theon Greyjoy's body is a ledger of loss, and a living proof that law is a thing men bend when the wind rises. Asha begs for her brother not to rule or to raid, but to take the black and be gone from the game that ruined him. She offers his name to an institution that can swallow it whole. Danis Baratheon measures the letter of sin against the need for swords at the edge of the world, and finds no justice simple enough to warm his hands. Whether he consents or condemns is less the point than this. Every lord with a captive remembers that the wall exists as a final gate for the damned. The watch, which once stood apart from politics, now lives at the end of a political thought. The flow runs the other way as well. It is not only common cells that empty into the snow. Power has learned that the watch is a safe place to bury its scraps of shame. Janos Slint, who climbed the city's ladder by kicking others off it, takes ship for Eastwatch by order, not by calling. He struts at Castle Black as if a crown lies hidden in his packs, calls brothers soldiers so he can claim to stand above them, and flatters a king to turn the choosing of a lord commander into a personal favor. He is not typical, but he is no longer unthinkable. When the Night's Watch becomes a sentence, the men who arrive carry more than chains. They carry habits. Eliezer Thorne is proof the pipeline is old, even when we pretend it is new. He fought for a king who lost, and he paid with his life. or what passed for it when the victor chose mercy. He served at the wall for decades, the long night of duty turning him sour, until even his jokes matched the weather. If you ask him, he will tell you he was exiled. He will say the wall is a place for the beaten. He will teach that lesson with every lash of his tongue. A school led by a resentful master does not keep its best pupils. Yet no one replaces him, because the institution cannot afford to lose the man who enforces the rules. This is what a sentence does to a garrison. It raises the value of the hard, the harsh, and the humorless, because they keep a rough body from tearing itself apart. Inside the castles, the ratios begin to change. Stewards matter more when the average recruit is not a reader, and the nights are longer than any story he has ever told. A steward must count grain that arrived late and will not arrive again. He must stand between a commander and the 1,000 small hungers of a brotherhood that does not yet trust one another. He must keep the raven speaking to a realm that has learned how not to answer. Samuel Tarley is only the most visible of these hands. He is not rare because he has learned, but because the watch is starved for men who can make literacy into logistics. He learns how to pull words into lines that carry help, and how to turn scattered birds into a nervous system for a border that no one else feels unless it breaks. The Lord Commander himself relies on this new steward's load. If a garrison is noisier and meaner than it used to be, the man at the center needs quiet counsel and clear numbers. Jorah Mormont, who once had more veterans than questions, now has more questions than horses. He needs a boy who can listen to Aemon and pick out what the old man means when his voice floats like ash. He needs a young officer who can take a daggered barracks and make it breathe without waking the knives. When the men are bound by a bargain more than a belief, leadership becomes a daily repair. More parchment, more patience, more food found at the end of empty barns. You can see the pipeline at work before a single oath is spoken if you stand on the King's Road in a hard year. Yorn's column snakes north, with a boy who has shaved his head to hide his sex, a smith's apprentice who does not yet know the value of his back, and 3 men in iron who watch the others like wolves trying to remember their names. The weather turns their lips blue, and the road hardens their feet. Yet none of that makes them brothers. That takes a right and a winter's worth of meals. Along the way some men slip into the dark, and others are dragged back to the path by force. Someone commits a quiet murder near a river for reasons no one will admit. Yoren buries no one he can drag, because the pipeline is a contract he cannot break. Somewhere behind them, a captain marks a line in his ledger. Here the trouble ended. Northward went the cost. Prestige erodes in loops, not lines. A house that once sent a spare son now keeps him close, because what father wants his boy to swear next to rapers and thieves? The next year, the castle gains another cutpurse to make up the count. Within a decade, new recruits learn that there are few high-born voices in the mess hall, so they raise their own. The old tales of glory feel thinner when no one at your table can claim a great haul. Faith is easier when you can point at a banner and smile. Faith is harder when your companion mutters the name of a city brothel in his sleep. Every brother who would have been mentor instead turns into guard, and every lesson that once started with love of duty begins with fear of the man across the room. The officers adapt by making the words work harder. Equality becomes the stick that beats back resentment. On the wall, we are all one house, they say again and again, until the shape of those words rubs smooth as bone. A man with a proud name hears the sentence and bristles. A man with no name hears it and straightens. The stewards wake earlier to get the meals out on time. The builders learn to sleep with a hand on the knife because a brother is still a man. Rangers choose companions by silence instead of song. The uniform becomes as precious as any sigil because it is the only thing that makes a room safe. A few rise above this calmly and do the work. More do it because if they fail, the arrogance down south will be proved right. What the realm achieves through this bargain is easy to list. Lords find a tidy end to troublesome heirs. The crown saves coin it would have spent on gibbets or on longer trials. The faith can bless forgiveness as if it were a sacrament, and sleep without asking who will hold the frozen shore when the ice breaks. The costs are delivered by raven, and ignored by men who have learned to ignore ravens. The watch, as a living thing, grows more brittle. It does not shatter because the body is strong, even when the spirit sweats. Still rides, still scouts, still mends curtain walls that weep mortar in the noonday sun. But beneath the acts of duty, a strange new hesitation grows. Do I trust the man beside me? Will the vow hold in the dark, if his vow began as a trade for his skin? Some say the erosion is exaggerated, that heroes come from ditches as often as from towers. It is true. A cutpurse can learn loyalty. A poacher can track like a prince never could. The watch has always been a place where a man could be remade, not just reassigned. The speech a commander gives at sunset is not a lie, is a target. The trouble is not that condemned men cross the world to take a vow. Trouble is what happens when the realm expects the watch to carry everyone's sins without paying for the weight. After a time, even a strong back bends if no one helps with the load. The crowning sign that the legal pipeline has become the norm is how everyone talks when a crisis hits the wall. Janos Slint offers flattery as if he were back in the Red Keep, and suggests the king lend his guidance to the choosing of a lord commander. He expects power to run like it did in the city, and he expects the watch to allow it. Stannis objects not because the watch has no need of kings, but because he knows a leaking pipeline when he steps in it. He has captives to dispose of, a realm to order, a war to fight. He has choices to make that involve the wall, yet even he finds the brothers stubborn. The old rule of internal elections does not fade because a man in a crown snaps his teeth. It persists because for all the pipeline has delivered, the watch still believes the men who will freeze and bleed should choose the one who says when. Discipline, too, hardens where the law has softened. Janos Slint thinks a command can be ignored in a frontier he treats as his backyard. He meets a different law when a young lord commander calls him to a wall and an edge of ice. The sentence is not exile this time, but a clean stroke. And the gathered brothers look on and learn that in the North words matter more than reputations. A city punishment replaced by a soldier's certainties. A lesson that would be unnecessary if the watch were not already filled with men who believe the rules are suggestions. If the realm ships you its worst habits, the watch must train itself to answer them. You can see the strain in the small rituals too. In choosing a ranger, in dividing rations after a failed harvest, in the patience it takes to keep men who do not love one another in the same room while a blizzard eats the horizon. It is there when Sam teaches a novice to tie a message to a raven's leg, careful not to shake, careful not to smudge the one word that might bring help. It is there when a steward stands behind the old bear and writes his words during a parley with men who once would have fled at the sight of black cloaks. The spectrum of duty widens to include acts once dismissed as soft. The Black brothers learn that a well-fed man makes a safer sentry, and a man who can read keeps a steadier hand in a crisis. These things were always true, yet they grow plain when the brotherhood grows rougher and the margin for error narrows. The cultural shift reaches families who never see the wall. Mothers begin to bargain with it in their hearts. A father warns a stubborn boy with the black the way another man might threaten a switch. In a small keep, a maester writes to a cousin in the city to ask if a wayward nephew can be tucked into a column headed north. The wall becomes not only a place but a solution, like a cold cellar that solves a rotten smell. No one intends insult. They intend relief, but respect kept as courtesy and abandoned as choice is the kind that can vanish in a season without anyone noticing. Then a year comes when the snows blow early and higher, and the realm looks up and remembers what it used to admire. By the middle of our tale, the twist is not in the watch at all. It is in the realm that uses the watch as a wastegate while calling it holy. Political enemies and failed favorites travel the same road as pickpockets. Courts that should fear the dark have discovered a way to move their fear somewhere far away. The watchwords of mercy and redemption are embroidered over decisions, driven by budget and discomfort. When the dead finally push at the tree line, the contradiction stands in the torchlight. The men on the wall are what the realm decided they would be. If you make an army out of bargains, you must lead with more care, or it comes apart. This is not a story that makes easy villains. Yoren is not a villain for taking the chained. He is a man who believes he is doing right by getting them out of a hole and into a purpose, and on many days he is correct. The judges who commute a death are not villains, and the lords who offer the black to defeated foes are not fools. There were ages when this bargain gave the watch the numbers it needed to cover miles of ice and forest that never shrink. But when a practice becomes a habit, and a habit becomes policy, no one counts the cost until the bill arrives. It arrives as a shortage of nobles who grew up in halls where duty was a taste, not a meal. It arrives as a need for stewards to grow twice as fast and 3 times as careful. It arrives as commanders who spend more time convincing than commanding. If the frontiers of a realm reflect its center, then the wall has become a mirror held up to a south that prefers quick fixes to hard funding. Grain will not till itself. Abandoned villages will not march back into fields because a charter still says they belong to the watch. When vows turn into sentences, the gap between purpose and people widens. To close it requires more than language. It requires lords who will send sons again, and kings who will make the border their own trouble instead of passing it along. It requires a culture that believes the night is real before the first rider returns with frost in his beard and terror in his voice. The brothers continue to speak the vow at sunset. A few are criminals who become heroes, because the wall gives them a cause bigger than any they stole for. A few are heroes who become criminals in the dark, because the vow was always too heavy. Most are men who do their work, sleep in cold beds, and complain about the cook. The difference, now that law has become a pipeline, is the pressure on the quiet middle. They must keep their eyes forward while the world uses their home as a dumping ground. They must hold together in a place built for unity, while the realm south of the neck learns that unity can be outsourced. We have traced the flow of bodies and names, moving north under a banner that still whispers of honor. We have seen how a vow can be a calling, a sentence, or both at once. We have watched new burdens settle on stewards and raven tenders, when discipline must hold a brotherhood mixed by necessity. And we have learned that prestige does not topple like a tower. It slumps like an old tent unless someone lifts the pole. The realm says the Night's Watch stands for everyone. In the same breath, the realm uses it to stand for everything it does not want to face. The next question is simple, and it changes everything. When the dead are no longer a tale, and the haunted forest is no longer quiet, what happens to a penal colony at the end of the world when it must become a shield again overnight? South of the neck, the wall felt like the edge of a map no one ever truly visits, a place for tall tales and punishments. In Old Town's halls, men in gray argued over whether the age when darkness fell had ever truly come. They weighed carved runes against Septon's ink, and found only fog. Samuel Tarley, bent over a scriptorium few bothered to light, watched pages crumble to powder under his fingers. The oldest books were gone, or perhaps never written. The first men left marks on stone, not vellum. So the stories people know were set down by Andal hands centuries later. He read of kings who ruled for hundreds of years and of mounted knights in a time before horses were steel. He read lists of lord commanders that did not match the numbers the watch recited at swearing. He read of obsidian daggers given each year by the children of the forest to the Night's Watch, a yearly rite of the age of heroes that no one in the South believed mattered now. And then, on the next page, the archmaesters dismissed it all. Skepticism became a solvent. It dissolved memory, then duty. Art, that solvent seeped into every decision. The realm had split among rival kings, each gripping banners and promises. And in their councils, the wall's warnings were weighed against marriages, sieges, winter stores, and new enemies at the gate. Jean Mormont sent ravens anyway, not to one claimant but to all. When a steward asked which king, the old bear answered in kind, "All of them, the true and the false alike. If they claim the realm, let them defend it." He did not expect much. A ranger who knew hard miles and harder choices said as much at breakfast, peeling an egg as if it were a map. "These kings will do what they will," he said, "and likely it will be little enough." The best hope lay with Winterfell. If the North could rally. Winterfell had always known what wind blew from the haunted forest. Yet even there, the drums of southern war were beating, and men and grain were marching out of the north toward fields far away from the wall. The Watch had once manned 17 castles along the Great Barrier. They were not simply walls of ice and cold nights. They were garrisons, stables, kitchens, forges, septs, and weirwoods, whole communities braced against the wind. They dwindled, one by one, as numbers fell and coffers thinned. By the time the Godswood at Castle Black grew quiet in those years, only 3 castles still held men. Everyone knew it, and Mance Rayder, the king beyond the wall, knew it too. The map was honest. The empty towers were like missing teeth in a smile that still wanted to reassure the realm. Their very emptiness became a public sign that anyone could see, yet few would fund. A lord could put his finger on a line of ink and say, "Here is the gap, here's the risk," and still not send sons or coin. Scarcity turns leadership into triage. Jean Mormont's quill scratched over hard choices. He rationed barley and salt beef. He sent fewer patrols into a forest that seemed larger each month. He counted the tower's barrels twice. He argued with himself over which empty forts to dream of manning again, whether Sir Eliza Thorne could return from the capital with fresh levies, and whether the small council would remember the North once they stopped arguing over who wore a crown. He spoke of moving men from the Shadow Tower to Greyguard, stripping one place thin to thicken another. Each plan was a gamble, that the snow would hold, and that the dead would not press before the barrels ran dry. Each plan also had an audience of crows on the wall. They did not care who sent the ravens, only that they flew. Disbelief showed in how people behaved. Far to the south in bright halls, the others were a punchline or a line from an old song. Small folk as far as King's Landing taught courage by scaring children with snarks and grumpkins in a story, much as septons once warned of demons to curb late-night sneaking. If the unknown lives only in bedtime tales, it does not appear in spring budgets. Against that mood, the Watch's oath of neutrality began to sting. The wall swore to take no side in the quarrels of the realm. In peace, that vow made the brotherhood trustworthy, a quiet referee at the end of the world. In war, the same neutrality made their pleas suspect. A raven to one king sounded like a slight to another. A letter to all kings sounded like a ploy to pry gold while keeping clean hands. With every southern road crowded by riders under different banners, a request for grain from the wall could be read a dozen ways, and many chose to read it as an insult. Indifference paid, especially if the North would bear the shame of letting an old order starve with dignity. Meanwhile, the forest wrote in a thicker ink. Rangers were vanishing. For 2 years, the trees swallowed men who knew every deer path they stepped on. Benjen Stark went north with men he trusted and did not come back. The Watch found 2 of his companions lying in snow, cold and still, until the night reached back and moved their hands. Jon Snow burned his fingers, saving his commander from a dead man who stood up again inside Castle Black. He woke later, staring at his bandaged palm and dreaming of a corpse with eyes like blue fire and hands like winter iron. He did not tell Sam more than he needed to, because Sam was already shaking. "There is no shame in fear," Jon's father had told him. "What matters is what you do with it." The Watch still had to do its duty, but the duty now was to warn, and warning had to move through a realm that had taught itself to distrust the very stories behind the warning. So the ravens flew, carrying words through storms and arrows. The old bear's words were spare and plain. They spoke of missing men, of cold bones that walked, of horn calls in the night that froze men's feet to the ground. He asked for men and grain. He asked for iron, wool, and mules. He asked for the small thing that costs little and means everything, attention. When words were not enough, he sent a steward down the king's road with a severed hand and a jar. The road took its time, and warm miles did their slow work on proof. When the jar reached a lord's hall beneath painted rafters, the thing inside had become more ordinary than any man at the wall remembered. Proof and time do not mix well. The small councils and war camps had other proofs on their tables, captured standards, and sealed oaths. The hand did not weigh as much as a city under siege. The cost of disbelief is often counted at the edge. The Lord Commander walked the wall and looked north with a man's memory of his own father's face. He knew he would not win grain by saying please. He would not win men by pointing at clouds and asking someone to believe that winter has teeth. He chose instead to range far and show what hid in the pines. If proof would not come south alive, then a watch still sure of its purpose would go north in strength and bring back what the eyes could not refuse. It was a plan born of scarcity and the old frontier confidence both. Concentrate men you can trust, move fast, and find the truth. Leave enough at the castles to hold the line if something breaks. Trust that the shield will not crack before you return. It was the right decision if the threat was as the maesters said, a story from Septon's ink. It was a different sort of decision if the enemy was already awake and watching. War feeds on the surplus. As the great ranging took shape, the southern wars boiled like pots that swallowed all they were given. Men left the new gift for safer towns. Grain that might have gone quietly to a watch steward went instead to armies with gold up front. The faith had its tithe to gather, and the citadel had hungry minds to house. Each was a fine claim in a peaceful year, and each became another mouth in a winter year. Neutrality made refusal simpler. The watch could not trade bread for promised victories under any banner. So what little bread remained was held for men who could promise a victory. The North bled its banners down the King's Road, and swore the watch would be remembered after. The South assumed a northern house would do as it always had, and send what was needed. Everyone counted on someone else. There was another piece to the neglect. As the watch became a place for the realms unwanted, it seemed to Southerners that sending men was already a kind of aid. Courts discovered that taking the blacks solved problems they did not wish to face. And in solving those problems, they convinced themselves that they were supporting the wall. A new brother cost the crown nothing beyond his escort north, yet on the night ledger of conscience, it counted as charity. In truth, the watch did not need more mouths to feed. It needed seed corn and a spring without raids. It needed stewards who were not learning letters at 20. It needed garrisons refilled with men who joined by choice, rather than fear. Jour Mormont looked at the brothers around him, and saw courage in many of them. He also saw bargains stitched into cloaks, promises made at the base of the wall, by judges and jailers, that no man in black had consented to. The cultural gap widened as years passed. In the Reach, the Night's Watch was a rumor attached to a curtain of white on a child's atlas. The tales of the long night existed in the same shelf as the dragons that once nested on the Dragonstone cliffs, and the heroes who swung swords made of dawnlight. A learned man might smile at an old text and place it back on a stack to write a sharper concordance of error. In the North, men still rode with their collars high and spoke of the cold as if it had a face. The old bear's hope that Winterfell would rally the North was an old hope because memory had a home there. Yet that home could not feed the wall alone, and the Stark's banners were sewn to southern wars, whether they liked it or not. Even the best hope had other work to do. At Castle Black, where belief was not a word but a schedule, mornings began with the sound of practiced swords, and ended with cold stew by firelight. Rangers who returned spoke in shorter sentences. They had seen trees that groaned and dead things that carried old weapons. They had seen tracks shaped wrong in the snow, Fewer returned each month. Brothers muttered in the hall about whether to send more men or pull the furthest lines back. Not because fear said so, but because numbers did. The Lord Commander could count. He knew there were not enough men to garrison empty forts and still patrol. He knew there were too many miles to watch with 3 strongholds. He could either pretend he still commanded a brotherhood the size of the songs, or he could shape plans with what he had and trust the gods for what he did not. The decision to ride for the fist of the first men was more than a tactic. It was a message. It said, "We are not hiding in our castles. We will meet the unknown at a place thick with memory and find out if the old names still mean anything." The fist offered a defensible hill above a sea of trees. It offered a view. And sometimes that is what a leader needs most, to see what moves on the horizon. Sam carried maps that no longer matched the land. Horin Halfhand moved like a man who had learned to hear branches before they cracked. Men laughed less around the fires. When they did, the laughter sounded like it belonged to other men. Ravens carried the last round of pleas south while the ranging wound into the wild. On parchment, Mormont kept his tone even. He did not beg, he reminded. He counted seasons. He wrote that empty castles were not tactical choices but symptoms of a long illness. He wrote that the realm had grown healthy enough to forget its bones, and that bones mattered most when the body fell. He could not write what he knew the letters would become when they reached hands down there. They would become one more scrap to file, one more proof that the watch was surviving somehow, if only because ravens still arrived on windowsills. Night fell on the fist with a kind of quiet that men talk about later in ways that never feel quite enough. The watch put up rings of stakes and set ward fires and posted triple watches. Every man there understood simple arithmetic. They were far from help. Even a raven would fly for long hours before it reached a rookery with a warm hand to open the letter. The cold had begun to bite again. The stars were so clear that a frightened man might take them for ice chips thrown up by gods from a river no one can see. Sam studied the sky and tried to make it letters. He could only make it eyes. South of the neck that same night, light from braziers inside a royal tent threw soft glows on a map that had no mountains of ice on it. A king ran a finger along the coast and spoke in a low voice about a harbor. His bannermen nodded. They had marching to plan. They had messages to answer. If a raven came, it would be read, and no doubt some would mean to act when they could. Acting is different when frost is not knocking at your own door. It is not that southern lords were villains. They were busy in a world of near wars and near famines of their own making. East at the Shadow Tower and west at Eastwatch by the sea, the thin garrisons heard less from Castle Black as the ranging put more trees and more silence between commanders. That was no surprise. Commanders had seen that pattern 100 times. 100 was a word men used when they meant too many to count. They waited anyway. The ravens that did come told them to hold their places and to keep their eyes north. Those orders were as old as the watch. Old orders feel like safety because they have been obeyed before, and the world did not end. The difference this time lay in how much empty land there was behind those orders. So much land, so few men. When word of the White in the Lord Commander's cell reached the further castles, it came as a rumor that made men set their cups down. That was undeniable for those who saw it, but denial does not travel alone. It brings a cousin called context. By the time a story goes south, context has built 100 tiny shelters where disbelief can rest. Maybe the cold preserves strange things. Maybe the northerners enjoy frightening tales. Maybe the watch exaggerates to refill its benches. The rangers at the fist could feel the weight of that context each time the wind blew over the stakes and made a sound like low speech. It is a heavy thing when the men inside a ring of fires know that the men outside it do not believe what they see. After years of neglect, a question becomes a test. That moment came when they drew a circle around the fist of the first men. The watch did not go there to die. It went there to learn what the South would not read. It went because letters had failed, because the law of neutrality was turned against them, and because the realm's wars were stripping the very granaries that once sent wheat past the neck. The watch had always been the shield that guards the realms of men. It had spoken those words so long they could sound like a benediction instead of a contract. On that hill, with fires guttering in iron braziers, and men stitching their gloves tighter with cold stiffened hands, the vow returned to its plain meaning. What happens when starvation and disbelief meet an enemy that does not trade, talk, or sue for truce? That is the question the North asked the trees in their silence. That is the question the South forgot to ask anyone at all. Jorah Mormont had done what a leader can do with little. He had sent the ravens. He had tightened the belts. He had chosen movement over stasis and proof over rumor. In doing so, he had placed the watch where it had always meant to be, at the point of first contact. The wall itself was a last contact, a place for sieges and scales. The fist was an eye. On the rim of the hill, the horns began to sound. 1 for rangers returning, 2 for wildlings, 3 for the others. The old code lived in every throat, though most men had never heard that third call outside of legend. As the sound rolled over the fires, every conversation in the camp stopped at once. Sam's breath plumed white. He knew the pages he had read were ash now, their arguments broken under the weight of that sound. Far away, a small council discussed winter stores that had nothing to do with this wind. In the space between a horn's call and the order to form the line, the scattered parts of the realm's long neglect met in one place, like tributaries finding a river. On the fist of the first men, disbelief had no more work to do. Hunger would. By the time the third horn faded over the ice, the watch was already in retreat. The great ranging was meant to gather proof and bring back strength. It had been shattered on white ground the color of bone, and the survivors stumbled south, in a march that felt like a confession. They reached Craster's keep with frostbitten fingers and cracked lips. Their old wildling host expected gratitude for bread and fire. What he offered instead was thin stew and colder contempt. He had always demanded payment, and the watch, starved of coin and honor for years, had little left to spend but patience. Craster's hall smelled of smoke and rancid meat, and the girls wore blue bruises. A lord of bog pigs, he mocked sworn men as beggars in black. Under that roof, discipline and duty, already frayed after the dead rose on the fist, began to split. No one there forgot that Craster gave his sons to the cold gods in the wood. No one missed that the old bear, Jorah Mormont, accepted it and looked away, because he had to shepherd his few remaining rangers home alive. The watch's vow to take no part in the quarrels of men had never faced a quarrel like this, inside one room, around one fire, with the dead beyond the trees and a hard man laughing in their faces. The mutiny came as mutinies often do, not with thunder, but with a quiet breaking. A thrown cup, a word spat too hard, a voice that said enough. Knives moved, faster than vows. At the center, a lord commander who had led them into the dark did not fall to a spear beyond the wall. He fell to blades held by his own sworn brothers. Jorah Mormont, the old bear, died in a common hall with his back to a trestle. Whatever innocence the institution had carried through centuries of slow decline died with him. Men sent to the wall as punishment proved the cynic's right. Tales of rapers at the wall, once a slur from southern smallfolk, found new fuel and would travel faster than any raven. From that ash, the watch reached Castle Black with fewer rangers and far more ghosts. The ledger was broken in truth now, not as metaphor. Stewards counted barrels and came up short. Builders inspected shattered gates and wished for men who were no longer there. The watch had been reduced to 3 manned castles for years, and even those were thin as paper. Castle Black, Eastwatch by the sea, the Shadow Tower, and 1,000 leagues of haunted forest in between. It was never an honest 1,000 brothers, not anymore, and fewer still when you subtracted the boys half-trained and the men too old to climb the stairs twice in a day. It was here that a centuries-old design choice turned from theory into a thorn. By ancient caution, Castle Black had no defensive wall to the south. By ancient caution, Castle Black had no defensive wall to the south. A boy once asked why anyone would choose that. And an uncle said the watch must never threaten the realm it serves. If a Lord Commander grew proud and reached for a crown, the lords of the 7 kingdoms could ride north and take his head without besieging a fortress turned against them. That humility, that precaution, was the price their founders paid for the realm's trust. The price came due when the danger was not kings or claimants, but raiders slipping around the wall with the sun in their eyes, and a gate left open to the warm side. Mance Rayder, once a brother in black, and then a king of the free folk by acclaim, called his scattered peoples to one banner because the true enemy walked. The realm to the south called them savages and scoffed at his crown. It did not change the count of spears. When the horn sounded and the fires burned bright in the haunted forest, Castle Black faced a pressure test it had not seen in living memory. The attack came from 2 directions, as if scripted by a careful mind. On the north, giants and mammoths heaved at the great gate below the wall. On the south, raiders, thens, and bowmen tried the undefended side. The very side the old builders had left open to appease distant kings. What looked like a lesson in humility had turned into an invitation to be cut at the belly. Numbers told a truth that panic could not. Garrisons were smaller. The lines were broken. Brothers held 3 towers on the wall with too few archers and too few hands for the oil. In the yard below, boys who only a season ago had learned to hold a shield straight now held their breath. Supplies for a great ranging had burned or vanished in the snow. The watch scrounged. They turned smithy oil into firepots, barrels into barricades, and one-armed pride into steel. Donal Noy, the smith who had lost a limb but not his command, became the kind of leader an institution invents when no one is left to appoint. When the gate bent under a giant's fury, he stood where titles could not reach, and proved again that craft and courage must serve when coin cannot. On the southern approach, the field turned to a maze of rope and shadow. Jon Snow, a steward by assignment and something else by necessity, found himself giving orders that men twice his age obeyed because they heard sense in them. He had walked with the free folk and knew how they moved. He trusted a builder to hold a tower, a drunk to hold a line, and boys to bend bows until their fingers bled. There was no glory in it. Only blunt choices made it speed, and the iron logic of thin numbers. Stay up on the wall, and you leave the yard to the raiders. Stay in the yard, and you give the giants the gate. The watch had too few men to do both well. They had enough to fail slowly on each front, or enough to improvise their way through the night. Improvisation won the night, if we can call it a win on a night when the dead were not the worst thing in the dark. Giants crashed, and mammoths bellowed, and people with no love for kings found themselves dying for a wall. Those kings would not man. The watch held. They held because rangers could still loose arrows straight, because builders could brace beams without being told twice, and because stewards knew that a pot of oil poured at the right time can be worth 100 men. They held because some part of the old vow still lived in men who were exiles by law, if not by choice. They held because failure had nowhere to go but south. Mance's host was not truly broken by the watch. It broke when a new banner rose from the trees, when the first cavalry line splashed through the mud and the free folk wheel broke. The brothers on the wall looked down and saw stag banners in the torchlight. Stannis Baratheon had come to the one frontier the south called a tale, and he came not for gold or harvest, but because a letter and a maester's warning stirred the part of him that still believed in duty. He arrived late, as the watch had long feared the south would. Yet late was not the same as never. In his wake came food, order, and the sort of stern will that can stand upright even in snow. Stannis's arrival proved a truth the Watch had muttered for years. The threat was real, the numbers not exaggerated, the need not a ploy. It also dragged politics back up the King's Road like a shadow at noon. The Watch honors all kings and obeys none. That is the tradition, the compromise that allowed them to exist apart from civil war. But kings bring offers that sound like rescue and feel like debts. Land grants, support against rival claimants, knights settled in the gift to tax and tend the soil, if only the Watch will bend a little and allow it. The ledgers needed it, the bellies wanted it, the oath cautioned against it. Every choice at Castle Black after the battle was taken in the crosswind. Between these three truths, there was still no Lord Commander. The old bear lay unburied or buried in rumor, and the candidates moved like tides. At Eastwatch, a hard man named Cotter Pike had salt in his blood and a temper that smelled like the sea. At the Shadow Tower, Sir Denis Mallister carried courtesy like a shield, and had seniority enough to ask for deference. Bowen Marsh, the Lord Steward, knew grain and grudges. Alizer Thorne sneered at reform, and demanded discipline as if he could beat courage into exhausted men with words alone. Janos Slint arrived with a lordly frown, but no stomach for standing the line. Elections at the Watch are not a jest, yet they are often a study in scarcity, like choosing between 3 empty sacks for which might carry more grain. Under duress, they counted tokens in a cold hall, smoke hanging in the rafters while men traded jokes in whispers. It should have taken weeks, but it could not. Maester Aemon, who had watched kings rise and burn, and was old enough to remember when the Watch drew sons instead of criminals, offered steady counsel. Samuel Tarly, who had learned what it costs to hold a gate when your hands shake, played the quiet game that politics calls wisdom and soldiers call luck. Clean majorities do not appear in starving halls. Coalitions do. When the last tally clacked into the cup, a 19-year-old with a bastard's name became Lord Commander of the Night's Watch, and with that choice the institution declared more than a preference. It declared that it would bet the wall on reform, as it had once bet on memory. John's ledger was as honest as the snow. 3 castles manned, and even those in name more than fact. Fewer than 1,000 brothers, and many of them old, young, or unwilling. Rangers who could not replace their dead, builders too few to mend a gate faster than the next frieze would split it. Stewards who had to stretch grain until it became soup a man could see through. The gift itself sat ragged under grey skies. Abandoned crofts, fallowed fields, stone holdfasts that once looked sturdy from a distance now looked empty up close. It is one thing to inherit a post at the frontier. It is another to inherit an empty pantry and a broken plough. The schisms sharpened even as the ink dried on the first orders. Traditionalists wanted a return to discipline you could hear in the yard. They wanted wickings and midnight watches, with every boy set to his task and a sergeant's boot close at hand. Reformers looked north and saw a different equation. They saw that an army of free folk, scattered and beaten by a southern king, would not simply vanish into the woods. The enemy who mattered was still out there, white and waiting. If the Watch bled the free folk in the snow would only return the favor in a colder form. The penal colony passed rows in every argument. Men who had come in chains took offense at lectures from men who had come for honor. Men who had come for honor asked how they were supposed to fight beside those who had killed their own Lord Commander. Public image failed to help. Tales of mutiny and cruelty have a way of walking fast from tavern to tavern. Stories of holding a gate in the dark travel slower and arrive with fewer ears ready to listen. Down in the great castles of the south, stewards counting casks preferred not to be reminded that a brotherhood of thieves and outcasts had saved the wall, and perhaps their harvests too. Donors do not line up for institutions that smell like scandal. And so the Watch, when it most needed the noise of honor to pull men north, found itself branded by its worst knight. The iron fact remained. Honor stories rarely reach the men who hire sellswords and plowmen. fierce stories do. Pressure came from both sides of the ledger. The land could not feed them without hands at the plow and animals in the stalls. The watch had too few of either to matter. The plan born in Winterfell was simple. Settle new lords in the gift and send their taxes to Castle Black instead of Winterfell. It died with the lord who backed it, and with the short season when hope might have carried it. Winter crept in slowly, then arrived all at once. Even the promise of land could not draw men north when the weather itself felt like a sentence. A watch that cannot feed itself must beg or fight, and either choice bends an oath that was not meant to bend that way. Under pressure, institutions reveal their joints. Under starvation, they reveal their bones. Jon's early orders tested everything. He chose to use prisoners of war not as fodder for the snow, but as potential shields against the thing the South still could not see. He offered the free folk passage through the wall to the south, settlement in the gift, and a chance to live, if they would lay down their spears and swear to peace. He did it not because his heart bled, but because head counts on parchment do not lie. Every wildling dead today is one more corpse who might stand against you tomorrow. This was frontier pragmatism, offered into a hall where traditionalists had built their whole identity on the purity of the vow. The vote for that policy did not settle the quarrel. It only shifted it. To traditionalists it looked like madness, a soft turn. They saw a boy commander who had learned from wildlings and carried those lessons home like foreign coins no one could spend. Reformers saw the only path that did not end with the wall held by a few dozen brothers, with empty quivers and no sleep. Penal colony resentments hissed in the gaps. A butcher from Flea Bottom and a knight's son did not hear the same speech when Jon spoke. A recruiter who spent 10 years gathering orphans and criminals in southern alleys did not carry the same memories as a builder who had scraped ice off the stones since he was old enough to swing a hammer. And yet the ice does not care which side you choose. The White Walkers do not debate your ledger. The institution had to take the shape of its needs. That shape, in this broken hour, looked like risk at every turn. Invite the free folk south, and you risk raids in spring. Reject them, and you risk an army of whites in winter. Take food from a claimant king, and you risk becoming his garrison. Refuse, and you risk hunger breaking the watch from within. Elect a young commander, and you risk inexperience. Elect the old, and you risk repeating the same cautions that had brought them to this precarious ridge. What mattered, in the day-to-day, was that the watch could now be measured in narrow things. How many arrows fletched by sundown? How many loaves set to rise? How many ravens left alive and trained? The brothers learned to think in stacks and sacks because grand strategy only works when you have a surplus to cover your mistakes. They did not. Every success came paired with a new gap. Every repair to a gate revealed a rotten beam behind it. The watch's great tragedy in this era is not that it lacked brave men. It is that brave men were asked to do impossible arithmetic. Outside, the stories sharpened still. The South heard of a mutiny at Craster's, and a Lord Commander knifed in his own camp. They heard of a boy chosen to lead a rabble of thieves. They heard, if they listened harder, of giants at a gate and banners that rode to the rescue only after the brothers had held through night. Perception became a force on the battlefield just as real as snow and stone. What little charity remained in the realm had to be spent 3 times to buy 1 barrel of wheat. And even then the barrel came late. Crisis works like this. It strips the fault lines bare and forces you to walk them. The watch had become a starved shield, bent back to block blows it could no longer afford. With Mance's hosts scattered and Stannis camped in the shadow of the wall, the institution faced a reckoning with itself that no outside enemy could spark. The reformers asked for trust. The traditionalists asked for obedience. The ledgers asked for grain, and the winter asked for everything else. Somewhere inside that triangle, a path forward had to be found, because an enemy still moved in the dark woods, where old gods listened, and frost did not melt at noon. If valor alone could restore an institution, that night at Castle Black would have done it. It did not. If a victory delivered by a claimant king could turn public appetite into lasting support, those banners in the torchlight would have done it. They did not. The watch came back from the brink with a hero's scars and a beggar's bowl, while the realm's attention drifted to the next rumor. The question sharpened. If crisis could not save the watch's honor on its own, what would it take to rebuild a mission once trusted without proof? And what would the watch have to sacrifice or become to scrape together the men, the land, and the belief needed to hold when the dead began to move again? For now, the shield held thin enough to see the world through it. The brothers returned to their drills, the stewards to their ovens, the builders to their roofs. The Lord Commander opened his doors to people who had been enemies at dusk, and by dawn he made them guardian. From the outside it looked like a gamble. From the inside it was the only math left that added up to a chance. The wall had stood for thousands of years on vows and stone. In this winter, it would have to stand on choices made under pressure by men still living with the echoes of a mutiny, the smoke of a gate, and the taste of a stew they could not forget. They had felt real pressure, and they had not broken. The weight did not go away. It only shifted. From here on, the stories told about the Night's Watch would be shaped less by the horrors they faced than by the bargains they chose to accept. Somewhere beyond the last firelight, wind moved through black trees, and the brothers on the wall watched the places where the dark did not seem quite as still as it ought to be. The third horn still echoes in the mind long after the sound fades. It is a memory that changes what the oath means. When men stand against what they were told did not exist, they learn whether those words were a sentence or a lifeline. The Night's Watch was called a penal colony when the horn sounded 3 times, yet in the snow and fear, honor surfaced anyway. Some ran, but more did not. A steward held a torch to a white. A blacksmith faced a chieftain in a tunnel. A bookish recruit raised a dragon-glass blade, and learned that even old stories can draw blood. Honor under fire is the first proof that decline is not destiny. It is also a warning. Individual courage does not sustain a wall that runs to the horizon, nor feed a garrison through a winter that bites deeper than memory. Courage buys time. Institutions decide what to do with it. The line that saved men that night was not a crown's decree or a charter. It was a simple pattern that returns again and again at the edge of the world. Night gathers, a man recalls the vow. He finds his place in it. And then, importantly, so must the realm. Reform, if it is real, cannot be a courtly fashion or a feather on a lord's cloak. It must be survival dressed in plain wool. When Jon Snow argued to bring the free folk through the gates, he did not claim novelty. He returned to the center of the vow. The shield that guards the realms of men is not a gate to lock one half of humanity on the wrong side and wait for the slaughter. It is a plain tool held between life and the storm. The realm made a mistake when it turned an enemy into an identity, when it decided that wildlings were wildness rather than neighbors who once learned different songs. Alliances that cross old taboos are not about sentiment. They are a matter of geometry. The wall is a straight line. The wall is a straight line that does not honor that line, and the defense cannot either. The settlements in the gift need hands and eyes. The watch has been cut to the bone and must act like a heart, pumping life into every empty holdfast and fallow field within a day's march. That means treaties with clans who once raided those same fields. It means oaths sworn to the wall rather than to southern sigils, and work details that build ovens and fences as seriously as they man the towers. Reform is a patrol with a ledger in one hand and a spear in the other. Neutrality, the old promise, needs teeth to be credible. The Citadel calls itself a servant of the realm, not the ruler. The watch must make that truth its own, and then demand that the realm do the same. When Stannis Baratheon rode north, he did not ask the watch to crown him. He asked for a battlefield and a place to winter his cause. The correct answer was not a pledge to his stag, but a ledger of what the wall required in exchange for every hearth and stable he used. A neutral institution lives by contracts that outlast factions. It needs written charters that bind great houses to supply, no matter who sits the throne or claims to storm it. Those charters should not be quaint ornaments in a maester's chest. They must be enforceable by custom and by cost. Every lord who grazes in the new gift must owe grain when the first snow sets. Every merchant who hauls timber from the haunted forests must return with nails and rope. A raven that carries warning should also carry an invoice. This is not mercenary logic. It is the price of honest neutrality. It is the price of honest neutrality. The watch serves all when it refuses to be captured by any. Yet service worth paying for must also be proven and seen. Proof for a long time came as rumor and rhyme. Then Ghost dragged a blackened hand out of the trees, and disbelief had to argue with what lay on the snow. Samuel Tarley pressed a dragonglass blade into cold flesh and felt the truth in his shaking fingers. Witness is not a story to tell by a warm fire. Witness should become policy. The ravens must do more than plead. They should carry sworn attestations, maps of dead villages, inventories of the strange metals that work where steel fails, and the names of those who stood and saw. Let the next small council minute carry the words of a steward who fought a corpse, not a distant rumor that can be dismissed between goblets. That council chamber, where courtiers argued whether to strike a girl across the sea to spare a war in the morning, revealed a broader logic that the watch can mine. Some men spoke of honor on open fields. Others spoke of cost in burned towns and broken children. Between them sits the cold arithmetic of survival. If the watch reframes its vow as a calculus that lowers the realm's losses, small minds will still quibble, but treasuries will open. My order serves the realm, not the ruler, the old maester said. The watch can echo that line in every letter. It can remind every faction that a cold enemy requires a warm alliance, and that frugality at the wall turns dear when graves multiply in the riverlands. Belief must meet budget. The gift and the new gift were not poetry. They were a supply chain. They became a memory because the watch let others work the land without weaving them back into the mission. To rise again, the fields must be made to feed the brothers by design, not charity. Mark the borders with clear stones. Lease plots to families who swear harvest tithes to Castle Black and keep a repaired buyer. Pair every new holdfast with a builder and a steward who know timber and ledgers. Encourage free folk to take the worst ruins and reward the best restorations with iron tools, salt, and winter seed. This is how a frontier breathes. It does not inhale empty promises. It fills lungs with bread. The law can help or strangle. For too long, judges and lords used the watch as a drain for the unwanted. It kept dungeons comfortable and conscience clean. That pipeline must narrow. Not every thief becomes a good man because he puts on black. The wall cannot be a place where sentences are dumped instead of served. Clear statutes should reserve the black for select offenders who show skills that the watch needs and the will to use them well. Everyone else can serve terms in the mines that once stripped the mountains. Everyone stripped the mountains. Stop stacking the ranks with men who hate their saviors. Recruitment needs a new story. If every tavern tale frames the watch as a last-ditch refuge, good men will take their chances at home. The vow should call to a different kind of listener. Tell the second son he may win no lordship, yet he can set his name in a ledger still read when castles are scoured clean. Tell the carpenter the wall has more work for his hands than any lord's hall, and that 1,000 men may sleep because one window does not rattle in a storm. Tell the ranger the wilds beyond the line will make him their map. Not everyone will answer. Enough will if the path to honor is clearer than the path to disgrace. There is room at the edge for apprenticeships that do not demand the black at once. A winter corps of teamsters and masons, paid modestly and excused from the vow, can surge when storms close passes and roads. Let those workers eat the same stew and feel the same wind that the brothers feel. Some will stay when their contracts end, and those who do will take the words with eyes open. The orders can be strengthened by a fourth that serves without oath, a ring of hands that does not confuse the mission but surrounds it. Training must change as well. Courage needs tools, and tools need practice. The watch has ancient strengths: silence, stealth, and patience in cold. It should add new ones pulled from honest observation. If dragonglass cuts what steel cannot, then build a forge that treats obsidian like a crop, mined, shaped, and stored with care. If fire is a friend, create disciplined torch teams with oil and sand, not wild blazes that cook the unwary. If ravens are the arteries, then literacy is armor. Make every recruit read and write before he learns to notch a bow. A wall that keeps its own records is harder to starve of truth. Command must be as nimble as a ranging patrol. Leadership won by vote has its own gravity. To keep that virtue without paralysis, set emergency powers that are clear and brief. When the horn sounds 3 times, the Lord Commander may take grain without a council and move men without a tally. When the snow stops falling, the books open. Accountability after the fact does not slow action. It gives the next commander a better map. Communication to the south must be a ritual, not a favor. Send a raven at each new moon, at minimum, with signatories from builders, rangers, and stewards. Keep a standing rider relay between the Shadow Tower and Winterfell. Make a clear promise that if a lord answers a watch summons with even a token force, he earns public mention. And if he ignores it, he earns a public mark of shame. The small things matter. A lion carved deep in a castle's great hall that says this house kept the oath in the long night is a coin that buys more loyalty than a purse of gold. Pride builds roads that taxes cannot. The watch's discipline toward politics should not soften its stance toward influence. It can accept aid from any king who rides north, but it should never let a king appoint its officers or place a banner atop a tower. Set this in stone. Carve it into the lintel of the Lord Commander's door. The moment the black cloaks become a colored wing of a southern cause, the rest of the South will starve them to hurt that cause. Neutrality with teeth is a boundary you can touch, and if you lean on it too hard, you get bit. There is a moral clarity here that does not need perfect men, only men who can return to a sentence when they grow confused. I am the shield that guards the realms of men. The vow is a narrow bridge, and that line is the handrail. It steadied a young man who did not know yet what the dead looked like, when a ranger asked him to say the words again under the moon. It steadied another in a godswood, when the trees watched with red eyes and the wolf arrived with a blackened hand. The meaning of a promise is often unlocked by its worst day. When you have a shield, you must decide what you are shielding. John chose to include the people his brothers once called enemies. It angered those who believed that the line should be clean, even if it bled more. Yet the first duty of a wall is to make sure that life continues behind it. The free folk cannot be protected if they are excluded from the realm of protection. More pointedly, they cannot be allies if they die. It is unfashionable in politics to turn enemies into citizens. It is also the only way to make a frontier more than a graveyard for stubbornness. The threat that gathers out there does not argue about heraldry. It does not pause for great councils or parades. That is the hardest message to teach a warm court. Proof can fade into a new rumor if it is not refreshed. The watch should adopt an annual witness, a delegation that travels south every harvest to speak in septs and halls and market squares. Not to terrify, which becomes noise, but to teach. Bring a dragonglass knife and the brittle shard of an icy weapon that snapped. Show where the handprints burned, in old wood. Tell the names of the fallen and the names of the saved. Stories become policy only when they are repeated, until a lord's son can recite them by heart. There is another lesson from the mutiny that ended a good commander's life in a stranger's hall. Discipline is not only about punishing the disloyal. It is about feeding the loyal. Starving men grow new gods. They forget the old words and find new ones that excuse what their stomachs demand. To keep knives sheathed in the dark, make sure a spoon fills a bowl in the light. Storehouses must be walled as carefully as courtyards. Grain against winter is not a luxury. It is obedience to the vow itself. If the watch will not take wives, then it must husband food. The brothers do not need to become saints. They need to become craftsmen of their own legend. That does not mean lies. It means that when a boy in the Reach hears the word Night's Watch, he should not imagine a chain on a wrist. He should see a line of men walking into a cold wind with purpose that no song can cheapen. He should know that if he takes the words, he gains no lands, no heirs, and yet he takes something few lords ever touch, a clean place in a long story. In a cynical age, you must sell the one thing you actually own, which is meaning. The idea of meaning does not refit a gate or pat horse. The watch must anchor myth to something you can measure. Count the arrows, tally the boots, publish the deficits. If a lord claims the frontier is well supplied, put a ledger in front of him. Show how many gloves reached Eastwatch. Then count how many men toil there without fingers, because those gloves never came. Numbers may feel unromantic, yet they cut through fog faster than a horn. They make it harder to sell indifference as prudence. Some will say that the watch cannot be what it was. They are correct. The river never walks upstream. But the past is not a lantern to stare into until your eyes ache. It is a mirror that shows you which parts of your face are worth keeping. In the high days, the watch did more than fill barracks. It tied the gifts of kings to a single cold truth, that life in the South slept because men in the North did not. That can be done again. Not with tens of thousands in black, perhaps, but with enough if their promise is flanked by law and bread. If the realm believes again, it will budget again. Belief is not a feeling. It is a habit. When a lord sets aside a tithe in autumn without a quill pushing him, that is belief. When a mother tells her child that the men in black are brave and not broken, that is belief. When a maester steers a promising student to the wall and calls it honor, that is belief. Belief must be taught. And then it must be measured. Not to scold, but to see whether the story and the supplies point in the same direction. This is the alignment that keeps institutions alive at the edge. Myth without mission is a song over an empty trench. Mission without means is a death march. Means without myth is a warehouse no one will fight for when the road grows red. The Night's Watch rose when those three faced the same way and took their next step together. It declined when they wandered apart. The horn blast forced a choice. The horn blast forced a choice. Either keep pretending the night is a rumor, or admit that the realm sleeps because someone stays awake and makes certain choices every day. So measure out the choices. Invite the free folk who will swear to the wall to tend plots in the gift and stand watch when the horn sounds. Write and renew charters that bind the riverlands and the vale, and the north to send rye, timbers, and boys who want a harder honor. Train rangers in old skills and new ones, with dragon glass blades and reading lamps. Keep a winter chorus that can surge without oath. Open the gates to help without giving away the keys of command. Speak the vow often and in public, until southern halls can finish the last line without prompt. When night gathers, as it always does, institutions either remember themselves or fade into the snow. The watch cannot erase its long slide into punishment and neglect. It can lay a way out, plank by plank. The vow has not weakened. People stopped listening. At the edge of the world, there is no room for confusion or pride. There is room for clarity, the kind you hear as a horn in the dark, the rasp of steel leaving its sheath, the low murmur of two men under a cold moon, repeating the same words, so the wind can carry them farther than fear. If the realm believes, then the budget will follow. If the budget follows, then the gift will bloom again, and the empty towers will have smoke rising from their chimneys. If the towers warm, then recruits will come not because they were dragged, but because they were called. If recruits come, then the watch will stand not as a relic or a sentence, but as a working thing that returns value every winter day. None of this is guaranteed. All of it is possible. The shield will not shine like it did in the old songs, but it can hold, and that is enough. Not for glory, not for crowns, for the realms of men. The dead do not care about our cleverness or our quarrels. They move when the air grows thin and the cold begins to sing. The living must answer with bread, ink, stone, and the old words, fitted to the present tense. It is a humble arsenal, and it is exactly what lasts. Night gathers. The wall waits. The watch rises when promise and practice shake hands and keep walking. When that alignment holds, the horn can sound as often as it likes. There will be someone there to hear it and to answer.